16. There are voices that make the world fall silent. And then there are stories so heavy they take a lifetime to tell. At 79 years old, Dolly Parton no longer needs to prove anything to anyone. She has already built the empire. She has already written the songs that outlived generations. She has already turned poverty into poetry and heartbreak into platinum records. But what she had never done, until now, was speak openly about the men who tried to break her before the world crowned her a legend. To understand the weight of what she reveals, you have to go back to the beginning. Before the rhinestones, before the stadium lights, before Jolene and I Will Always Love You became global anthems. There was a wooden cabin in Tennessee with no electricity and no running water. There was a little girl, the fourth of 12 children, singing to drown out hunger. That girl learned early that survival meant resilience. But she had no idea how brutal survival in the entertainment industry would become. When Dolly arrived in Nashville at 18, she carried a guitar, a notebook full of lyrics, and a dream bigger than the skyline. What she did not carry was protection. She was young, ambitious, visibly different, and undeniably talented. In a male-dominated industry that often mistook beauty for weakness, she became an easy target. Executives evaluated her body before her voice. Producers questioned her intelligence before hearing her songwriting. Journalists mocked her appearance as if glamour canceled out genius. She has often joked about the wigs, the makeup, the exaggerated femininity. But beneath the humor was strategy. Dolly understood something early. If the world insisted on looking at her, she would control what they saw. If they reduced her to an image, she would build that image into armor. What they did not see were the locked rooms, the conditional contracts, the whispered propositions disguised as opportunities. They did not see the nights she cried in bathroom stalls after refusing to compromise her integrity for advancement. The public saw sparkle. The industry saw leverage. Over nearly 7 decades, Dolly Parton transformed herself into more than a singer. She became a brand, a philanthropist, a cultural institution. She gave away millions of books to children. She built businesses worth billions. She earned admiration across political and generational lines. Yet behind the carefully constructed grace was a ledger of betrayals she never publicly addressed. Until now, at 79, the calculus changes. Reputation is secure. Legacy is cemented. Fear loses its grip. In this stage of her life, speaking is no longer risky. It is liberating. And for the first time, Dolly names 5 men who, in different ways, attempted to silence, exploit, or diminish her. This is not a story about revenge. It is about reclamation. It is about closing doors that were once forced open without consent. It is about reminding the world that behind every icon is a human being who survived more than applause. And the first round began when she was just 19 years old, trusting the wrong man in a city that promised dreams but demanded a price. The first man Dolly ever trusted in Nashville did not look like a villain. He looked like opportunity. At 19, newly arrived in Music City, Dolly Parton was still learning how the machinery of fame operated. She had the voice. She had the songwriting instinct. What she did not yet understand was how power moved quietly behind studio doors. That was when she met Jimmy, a seasoned producer with connections, influence, and the kind of confidence that convinces a young artist she has finally found her break. He welcomed her warmly. He praised her mountain authenticity. He told her she was different from the polished Nashville hopefuls who chased trends instead of truth. To a teenager hungry for validation, his words felt like oxygen. He offered her a small recording contract, studio time in a respected basement facility, and, most intoxicating of all, a promise. Just trust me. I'll take care of everything. Trust. That was the currency she paid with. The recording sessions went smoothly at first. Jimmy positioned himself as mentor and protector. He adjusted arrangements, gave notes on phrasing, encouraged her to lean into vulnerability. He framed his authority as guidance. And Dolly, eager to prove she was more than a pretty face with big hair, worked tirelessly to earn his approval. Then came a night that redefined everything. After a late session, Jimmy asked her to stay behind to fix a vocal nuance. The other musicians left. The studio hallways grew quiet. The fluorescent lights hummed in that cold, mechanical way they do in empty buildings. Dolly followed him into a smaller soundproof room. The door closed. It locked automatically. What happened next did not involve violence. It involved proposition. He stepped too close. His hand landed on her shoulder. His tone changed from professional to transactional. One compromise, he implied. One moment of cooperation. In exchange, doors would open faster. Tours would be secured. Radio play would be guaranteed. Dreams expedited. It was not framed as coercion. It was framed as strategy. For a 19-year-old from rural Tennessee, the moment felt surreal. She later described it as the instant she realized the industry was not built on talent alone. It was built on leverage, and leverage often demanded silence. She refused. She left the studio shaken, heels catching against the concrete floor as she hurried toward the exit. The next morning, she still believed integrity would not cost her everything. But within days, her scheduled appearances began disappearing. Tour commitments were postponed. Her contract was under review. Industry whispers followed. That blonde girl doesn't understand how things work. The message was clear. Compliance was currency. Jimmy never had to publicly discredit her. The system handled that quietly. Opportunities slowed. Invitations faded. And for the first time since arriving in Nashville, Dolly felt the cold edge of professional isolation. It was not merely rejection. It was engineered marginalization. What makes this wound significant is not scandal. It is psychological fracture. Dolly has said that moment almost silenced her creatively. Not because she doubted her talent, but because she understood the hidden cost of advancement. If every door required surrender, survival meant constant vigilance. Instead of retreating, she recalibrated. She sharpened her songwriting. She negotiated harder. She learned contract language. She observed who held power and who merely pretended to. The industry that attempted to intimidate her inadvertently trained her. That early betrayal transformed naivety into strategy. Jimmy becomes the first name she now speaks, not because he physically harmed her, but because he attempted to convert her ambition into a commodity. He saw expiration where she saw evolution. He mistook youth for pliability. At 79, when she reflects on him, her tone is not explosive. It is precise. She does not accuse with rage. She identifies with clarity. That distinction matters. Rage is reaction. Clarity is control. She once said she learned an essential rule that night. Sacrifice is sometimes necessary in show business, but the only thing never negotiable is yourself. That principle would define the next 6 decades of her career. But it was forged in a locked studio room by a man who underestimated a mountain girl with a voice that refused to die. And just when she believed professional betrayal was the worst kind of wound, she would discover that emotional betrayal cuts far deeper, especially when it arrives disguised as love. If Jimmy taught her how power manipulates ambition, the second man taught her something far more devastating: how love can be weaponized. By the time Frank entered her life, Dolly Parton was no longer the naive 19-year-old navigating studio corridors alone. She had tasted success. She had radio play. She had applause that echoed beyond Tennessee. But fame, for all its brightness, carries a particular kind of loneliness. The higher you rise, the fewer people you trust. And when someone appears who seems uninterested in your spotlight, it feels like oxygen. Frank was a respected country voice in his own right. Smooth, charming, articulate. He did not approach Dolly with propositions or contracts. He approached her with listening. That alone distinguished him from the others. He attended her performances, but never competed for attention. He asked about her writing process. He inquired about the emotional weight behind certain lyrics. He told her he admired not the wigs or the image, but the mind beneath it. For a woman who had spent years defending her intellect against mockery, this felt revolutionary. Their relationship unfolded quietly. No flashing headlines. No public spectacle. It was dinners in modest restaurants. Evenings in small apartments where she could remove the stage persona and sit barefoot on the floor, strumming unfinished melodies. He created space for vulnerability. And vulnerability is the most valuable currency a celebrity possesses. Dolly confided things she had never said aloud. She spoke about early humiliations, about the bathroom stall tears, about fears that success might collapse overnight. According to the narrative she now reveals, she even disclosed deeply personal experiences, moments of grief, private health struggles, and episodes of emotional despair that had nearly pushed her to the brink. Frank listened. He nodded at the right times. He reassured her. He positioned himself not as rival, but refuge. What Dolly did not know was that refuge had walls wired with intention. Hidden microphones were allegedly placed in the living room. Recording devices concealed beneath furniture. A small camera positioned discreetly behind a bookshelf where she often wrote lyrics in pencil, believing she was unseen. 3 years of intimacy. 3 years of confession. 3 years of quiet surveillance. The cruelty of this betrayal lies not in volume, but in patience. There was no explosion, no violent confrontation, just methodical extraction. Every insecurity archived, every vulnerable admission preserved. In a pre-digital era, this kind of documentation required planning. It required forethought. It required motive. And the motive, she claims, was profit. The recordings were allegedly sold to a journalist in a lucrative arrangement. Exclusive rights to what was framed as Dolly Parton's true emotional world. Not the polished interviews, not the rehearsed anecdotes, but the unfiltered woman behind the icon. When fragments of private conversations began surfacing in tabloids, Nashville reacted with fascination. Fans are confused. Industry executives grew cautious. Endorsement discussions paused. The public narrative shifted subtly from invincible legend to emotionally fragile woman. That shift matters. In celebrity ecosystems, perception is equity. Once vulnerability becomes spectacle, control erodes. Dolly reportedly withdrew from public appearances for over 2 months. 74 days of silence. For an artist whose life had been measured in tours and studio sessions, disappearance was not casual. It was strategic retreat. What makes Frank's betrayal distinct from Jimmy's is emotional depth. Jimmy attempted transaction. Frank allegedly engineered intimacy. One tried to buy compliance. The other harvested trust. Dolly later described the sensation not as anger, but contamination. Love songs she once performed effortlessly became complicated. Certain lyrics carried the ghost of conversations that had been recorded without consent. The stage felt different, not because she lacked talent, but because she had glimpsed how easily authenticity could be commodified. Psychologically, this type of betrayal fractures core identity. Artists rely on emotional truth to create. If emotional truth becomes dangerous, self-censorship follows. For a songwriter of Dolly's caliber, that threat was existential. And yet, she did not publicly retaliate. There were no dramatic press conferences. No lawsuits splashed across headlines. Instead, she recalibrated again. She tightened her inner circle. She restricted access. She became both warmer on stage and more fortified behind it. The public persona expanded, brighter, more generous, more philanthropic. It was not denial. It was counterbalance. When a narrative attempts to reduce you, expansion becomes resistance. Frank, in her current reflection, is not described as monstrous. That is what makes it unsettling. She calls him sweet. She emphasizes that cruelty does not always arrive loud. Sometimes it sits quietly beside you, asking about your day. This story also underscores a broader cultural dynamic. Women in the public eye are often expected to be emotionally accessible. Fans demand relatability. Media demands confession. Intimacy becomes brand value. But when that intimacy is extracted without consent, the cost is internal. By revealing this chapter now, at 79, Dolly reframes herself not as victim, but as survivor of emotional espionage. The disclosure serves dual purpose. It closes a private wound and aligns her with modern conversations about privacy, consent, and exploitation long before social media normalized constant surveillance. Importantly, the narrative positions her disappearance not as weakness, but as boundary setting. Silence became self-preservation rather than shame. The most striking line attributed to her reflection is simple. He didn't need to hit me. He just needed to listen and then sell what he heard. In that sentence lies the full weight of betrayal. Frank becomes the second name on her list, not because he broke her career, but because he momentarily destabilized her faith in intimacy itself. And when trust collapses, rebuilding it requires more strength than climbing any chart. Yet even this was not the deepest cut, because financial betrayal, especially when tied to charity and children, would soon test something far more foundational than love. It would test her belief in goodness itself. If the first betrayal attacked her ambition and the second poisoned her trust, the third one struck at something far more sacred, her purpose. By the time Martin entered her professional world, Dolly Parton was no longer simply a country singer. She was an institution, a businesswoman, a philanthropist, a cultural force whose influence extended beyond music into literacy programs, scholarships, and economic development in underserved Appalachian communities. Her charity work was not a branding accessory. It was personal. She had grown up in poverty. She understood what it meant to lack books, opportunity, and institutional support. Every scholarship fund and literacy initiative she backed carried emotional history. It was not public relations, it was repayment to the mountain girl she once was. Martin did not enter her life with charm or romance. He arrived with spreadsheets. A financial advisor and investment strategist, he projected reliability, calm voice, conservative wardrobe, analytical language. Unlike the previous men who approached her through emotion or ego, Martin approached through structure. He spoke in terms of sustainability, growth models, tax efficiency, philanthropic optimization. He did not flatter her beauty. He flattered her vision. He suggested formalizing a charitable expansion, an initiative focused on books and scholarships for economically disadvantaged children in Appalachia. The proposal was polished. The projections were persuasive. The compliance frameworks appeared airtight. For nearly a decade, he managed portions of her philanthropic infrastructure. Trust, in this context, was procedural. Contracts signed, checks authorized, audits reviewed. But power often hides inside complexity. According to the narrative now resurfacing, an independent audit uncovered irregularities in project accounts. The figure, over $4 million, was not abstract. It was funds earmarked for educational programs, withdrawals lacking documentation, transfers routed through entities not transparently connected to the foundation's mission. When confronted with anomalies, Dolly reportedly did not react with immediate outrage. She requested verification, a second review, a third confirmation. Emotional betrayal had already taught her caution. Financial betrayal required proof. The proof arrived cold and unambiguous. Shell entities linked to individuals within Martin's orbit. Paper trails, transaction histories, timelines that could not be explained as clerical error. Unlike Jimmy's proposition or Frank's surveillance, this was not intimate. It was institutional, and that made it heavier, because the damage extended beyond her personal loss. It implicated children, communities, public trust. The line she is said to have reflected privately captures the moral weight. I felt stripped bare in a church, not because of the money, but because of accountability. Charity operates on moral capital. Once that capital is compromised, even inadvertently, reputational integrity fractures. What distinguishes this betrayal from the others is her response. She did not initiate a public spectacle. No televised accusation. No extended litigation campaign. Instead, she allegedly covered the financial deficit personally, ensuring the programs continued uninterrupted. The charity, she insisted, would not suffer. The children would not feel the consequence of adult corruption. This is strategic containment. From a reputational risk perspective, public lawsuits against financial advisors often generate prolonged media cycles. Prolonged cycles invite scrutiny. Scrutiny invites doubt. Dolly's brand has long been built on warmth and trust. Protecting that ecosystem required precision. Martin disappeared from her professional circle within days of discovery. No dramatic farewell. No public confession. Silence, again, functioned as boundary. Yet internally this cut differently. Money, she has often said, can be rebuilt. Reputation can be restored. But betrayal tied to goodness destabilizes worldview. If someone can exploit philanthropy, what remains untouchable? This question sits at the core of Part Bond. Philanthropy is identity extension. For Dolly, charitable work was not separate from artistry. It was evolution of it. Her songs told stories of struggle. Her programs attempted to rewrite them. When financial misconduct threatened that narrative, it challenged not her fame, but her faith. Psychologically, this stage marks transition. The first betrayal taught vigilance. The second taught emotional boundaries. The third taught structural oversight. After Martin, her systems reportedly tightened. Independent reviews increased. Transparency protocols deepened. Access narrowed. Betrayal became blueprint refinement. There's also a broader cultural layer here. Women who accumulate wealth and then steward that wealth publicly are often subjected to higher scrutiny. When financial irregularities surface, regardless of fault, public reaction can be swift and unforgiving. By absorbing the loss quietly, Dolly preserved both the mission and the perception of stability. Critically, she did not frame Martin's betrayal as greed alone. She framed it as moral failure. The distinction is important. Greed is predictable. Moral collapse is corrosive. In reflecting on this chapter at 79, her tone is not explosive. It is weary, not because she regrets philanthropy, but because she recognizes how even the purest intentions require armor. And yet, she did not withdraw from giving. If anything, her charitable footprint expanded in the decades that followed. Millions of books distributed, scholarships funded, disaster relief contributions delivered. The response to theft was amplification. That is strategic resilience. Martin becomes the third name not because he destroyed her finances. He did not, but because he tested the durability of her belief in humanity within the entertainment ecosystem. And for a moment, she has admitted that belief flickered. I can lose money, she is said to have reflected. I can lose reputation. But when I lost faith in goodness, that nearly cost me myself. In that sentence lies the deepest consequence of financial betrayal. But even this would not be the most publicly humiliating wound, because soon a director would prove that in Hollywood, control over image can wound more visibly than stolen funds, and that editing can be as invasive as touch. If money tests trust and love tests the heart, image tests identity. And in Hollywood, identity is currency. By the time the fourth man entered her story, Dolly Parton had already survived propositions, emotional espionage, and financial betrayal. She understood contracts. She understood leverage. What she underestimated, briefly, was the power of post-production. Rex Hamilton was not an obscure filmmaker. He carried industry prestige, awards, critical respect, the kind of resume that reassures actors they are in capable hands. When he approached Dolly in the mid-1980s for a film project, it was framed as artistic elevation, a romantic drama with emotional nuance, a chance to explore depth beyond a rhinestone persona. The script, on paper, was tasteful. One pivotal scene described her character entering a pool at sunset, removing heavy outer garments as metaphor for emotional rebirth. It read as symbolic liberation, vulnerability without vulgarity, poetry, not provocation. Dolly reviewed it carefully. She had always been meticulous about boundaries. She built her image intentionally. Hyperfeminine, exaggerated, glamorous, but controlled. Every wig, every silhouette, every gesture was curated. She understood that spectacle could coexist with dignity, as long as she remained author of the spectacle. Filming proceeded without incident. The scene in question was shot with restraint. Soft lighting, minimal framing, no gratuitous exposure, professional environment, no alarms triggered. The betrayal happened later, in the editing room. When the film premiered, the audience reaction was not contemplative silence. It was stunned discomfort. The scene had been reassembled. Extreme zooms, slow motion, provocative scoring layered underneath, angles that lingered longer than agreed upon. What was scripted as symbolic shedding became sexualized spectacle. 48 seconds. 48 seconds that reframed narrative intention. Critics debated whether it was bold or exploitative. Talk show hosts joked. Tabloids amplified screenshots. The conversation shifted from storytelling to body commentary. The nuance vanished. Dolly reportedly sat in the theater and felt something familiar, loss of control. This was different from Jimmy's proposition. He attempted to access her body directly. Rex accessed it indirectly through framing, through lens, through edit. In cinema, editing is authority. It decides what the audience sees, how long they see it, and what emotion accompanies it. It is the final narrative voice. And in that voice, Dolly's consent was diluted. When Rex later appeared on a late-night program dismissing concerns, claiming artistic integrity, suggesting audiences were projecting their own interpretations, the wound deepened. There was no acknowledgement of trust breached. No recognition that creative collaboration requires mutual boundary respect. Dolly's response was strategic absence. She declined promotional interviews. She refused to defend the scene publicly. Silence, once again, became shield. Not because she lacked argument, but because engaging would further amplify the framing she did not control. The psychological impact here is distinct from prior betrayals. This was humiliation at scale. Financial loss is private. Romantic betrayal can be concealed, but cinematic objectification unfolds before millions. An image, for a woman in entertainment, is double-edged. Too modest, and she is criticized. Too bold, and she is condemned. Dolly had long walked that tightrope masterfully. She leaned into exaggeration to neutralize judgment. By presenting herself as knowingly theatrical, she preempted ridicule. But this edit attempted to reposition her, not as architect of exaggeration, but as participant in exploitation. The difference is agency. In later reflections, she reportedly wrote a single line in her diary that year. "I'm not afraid of people seeing my body. I'm afraid of a man using it to stain my character." That line reveals the core injury. This was not prudishness. Dolly has never been ashamed of femininity. It was about authorship. She had spent decades proving that hyperfemininity and intelligence were not mutually exclusive, that glamour and business acumen could coexist, that curves and contracts could share the same room. The edit threatened to flatten that complexity. From a broader cultural lens, this moment aligns with a long-standing Hollywood pattern. Actresses' bodies repurposed in post-production to maximize commercial attention. Scenes extended, angles emphasized, marketing materials reframed, artistic intention subordinated to market appetite. Dolly, however, did not escalate into public warfare. She recalibrated again. Future contracts reportedly included stricter editorial oversight clauses. Approval rights tightened. Image control became non-negotiable. If earlier betrayals sharpened her instincts, this one hardened her infrastructure. Rex becomes the fourth name not because he touched her, not because he stole money, not because he recorded intimacy, but because he manipulated perception. In an industry built on illusion, perception defines legacy. And legacy is the only currency that outlives youth. By 79, when she revisits this chapter, her tone is analytical rather than explosive. She does not need to dismantle him publicly. Time already recalibrated her reputation. The films that endure are not defined by 48 seconds. They are defined by decades of authorship. Still, the memory remains instructive. There are many forms of violation. Some leave bruises. Others leave altered narratives. And yet, Even after surviving coercion, surveillance, theft, and public reframing, the final betrayal would not come from a producer, a lover, or a director. It would come from colleague, a man who stood beside her under stage lights, who harmonized with her voice, who shared awards and applause. Because sometimes the most cutting wound is not exploitation, it is belittlement from someone who once called you partner. If the first four men challenged her safety, her trust, her finances, and her image, the fifth challenged something even more personal, her legitimacy. By the time Owen entered the final chapter of this reckoning, Dolly Parton was already an established force. She had chart-topping records. She had crossover success. She had built a brand that transcended country music and entered mainstream American culture. But success does not eliminate envy. In fact, it often magnifies it. Owen Michaels was not an outsider. He was a collaborator, a duet partner, a man whose voice blended seamlessly with hers on multiple hit albums. On stage, they appeared unified, two artists exchanging harmonies, trading smiles, feeding off crowd energy. Award shows framed them as a golden pairing. Interviews highlighted their chemistry. Fans adored the dynamic. But proximity to brilliance can generate insecurity. Behind the curtain, according to Dolly's later reflection, Owen's admiration began curdling into resentment. Crowds chanted her name louder. Critics praised her songwriting more frequently. Industry executives negotiated harder for her billing placement. She never dimmed herself to accommodate anyone, and she certainly did not surrender control of her stage presence. For some collaborators, that confidence inspires respect. For others, it ignites competition. The defining moment did not happen in a studio or boardroom. It happened at a post-awards gathering, casual, crowded, loud with celebratory chatter. As Dolly prepared to step out for a performance, Owen reportedly stood among peers, raised a glass, and delivered a line that would travel faster than any tabloid headline. She doesn't need a mic. All she has to do is shake her boobs, and the whole place claps. It was not shouted. It was not part of a public speech. It was said with a smirk, intended as a joke. But jokes reveal architecture. They expose underlying beliefs. A crew member overheard. The comment reached Dolly before she reached the stage. What makes this wound different is scale. No cameras captured it. No contracts were broken. No money was stolen. Yet the insult cut directly at the foundation of her career. The assumption that her success stemmed from spectacle rather than skill. For decades, Dolly had balanced exaggerated femininity with sharp business intellect and undeniable songwriting prowess. She built her aesthetic intentionally, leaning into glamour to disarm critics who underestimated her. She once famously said it takes a lot of money to look this cheap. The humor masked strategic brilliance. Owen's remark attempted to erase that brilliance. It reduced decades of craft to anatomy. And this time, she did not retreat. She walked onto that stage. She picked up the microphone. And instead of choreography or embellishment, she delivered an a cappella ballad, pure, unfiltered vocal power. No backing track, no movement, no distraction. The hall rose to its feet. It was not confrontation. It was demonstration. That performance reframed the narrative instantly. It answered insult without mentioning it. It reminded the room that glamour is surface, but talent is structure. Afterward, she reportedly sent him a message containing 9 words, "Don't ever step on stage with me again." No public feud followed. No interviews dissecting tension. The partnership dissolved quietly. Owen becomes the fifth and final name, not because he exploited her body or her bank account, but because he attempted to belittle her life's work in a single sentence. Belittlement, especially from peers, corrodes differently than overt betrayal. It seeks to shrink. At 79, when Dolly reflects on these 5 men, the pattern becomes clear. Each tried to redefine her without consent. The producer attempted to trade ambition for access. The lover monetized vulnerability. The advisor siphoned philanthropy. The director reframed her image. The colleague minimized her talent. But none of them succeeded. If anything, Each fracture reinforced her autonomy. She renegotiated contracts. She fortified boundaries. She sharpened control over narrative and stage. What might have broken someone less resilient became calibration points. I used to think the worst thing was being deceived, she has suggested. Now I know the worst is being diminished by someone who knows your power. And perhaps that is the core revelation at 79. Not hatred, not revenge, but clarity. 5 men, 5 attempts to reduce her, and 5 failures. Because the mountain girl who once sang to drown out hunger did not climb in a legend by accident. She climbed by refusing to surrender authorship over her voice, her body, her money, her image, and her name. At 79, Dolly Parton does not speak with bitterness. She speaks with completion. 5 men, 5 betrayals, 5 moments where the world could have tilted differently. When you examine them together, a pattern emerges, not of victimhood, but of attempted authorship. Each man, in his own way, tried to write a version of her story without her permission. One tried to exchange opportunity for compliance. One tried to monetize intimacy. One siphoned faith through financial deception. One manipulated image through edit. One reduced mastery to anatomy. But none of them controlled the final draft. That is the central truth of this chapter in her life. Not that she hated them, not that she sought revenge, but that she refused to let silence define her legacy. For decades, she absorbed, recalibrated, adapted. She built contracts tighter, circles smaller, boundaries clearer, and she kept singing. There is something profoundly strategic about the timing of her voice now. At 79, legacy is no longer fragile. It is fortified. She has outlived trends, outlasted scandals, surpassed critics. Her catalog is immortalized, her philanthropy institutionalized, her brand stabilized across generations. Speaking now costs her nothing. It reclaims everything. What makes this revelation powerful is not the names, it is the principle. She is reminding the world that success does not immunize you from exploitation. That glamour does not negate intelligence. That generosity does not eliminate risk. And that even icons bleed in private before they shine in public. There's also a deeper cultural resonance here. For decades, women in entertainment were told to endure quietly, to protect the machine, to avoid appearing difficult, to prioritize marketability over truth. Dolly's decision to identify these wounds late in life disrupts that conditioning. It reframes endurance as strategic patience, not submission. I still smile. I still sing, she has said, but this time I choose to speak. That line matters, because speech, in this context, is not exposure. It is closure. She is not dismantling her past. She is sealing it. The door she references is not slammed in anger. It is shut with finality. Those men no longer occupy narrative space inside her legend. And perhaps that is the most important distinction. Legends are not built on the absence of pain. They are built on the refusal to be defined by it. The little girl from a Tennessee cabin with no electricity did not survive hunger, humiliation, and Hollywood by accident. She survived because she learned early that her voice was not negotiable. That voice wrote songs that crossed decades. That voice funded books for millions of children. That voice filled arenas without needing to prove its worth. At 79, she is not rewriting history. She is clarifying it. 5 men attempted to diminish her. None of them outlived her resilience. And when the music fades and the lights dim, what remains is not scandal, not insult, not edited footage, but authorship. Her voice, still hers.